Please give me a quick wave. Awesome. Vanessa, are you able to see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started this morning. We welcome you to the Records Retention and Evidence webinar. We're excited to be able to provide you with information about records retention and corresponding evidence for EPPs. We will not answer questions during the presentation today, so please ask any questions you have using the question feature on the webinar toolbar. Questions submitted during the presentation will be used to create a frequently asked questions document that will be posted along with the recording of the presentation. The FAQ document and recording will be available on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. This webinar is being presented by the TEA Division of Educator Data and Preparation Program Management. I am Program Specialist Lori Ayers. TEA staff also attending include Program Specialists Vanessa Alba, Emily Newton, Angela Von Hatten, and Directors Mark Olafson and Tam Jones. Please note that hereafter in this webinar, when I refer to you, I am referring to your Educator Preparation Program, or EPP, since you are here as a representative of your EPP. We will cover the following topics today: the purpose for collecting and retaining evidence and records, the types of evidence that need to be collected and retained, and how those records are retained. Let's begin by reviewing the background and purpose for records retention. 19 TAC 228.40F requires the retention of records for candidates and provides detail about the evidence that must be retained in the EPP records. This rule identifies the EPP must retain evidence of a candidate's admission and also evidence the candidate completed all of the program requirements. The pieces of evidence you collect will depend on the requirement being met by the EPP or candidate. This rule also identifies how long records must be retained for at least 5 years after the candidate completes the program or withdraws from or is released from the program. (19 TAC 228.10B2) is embedded in the rules regarding the 5-year continuing approval review of the EPP. This rule is part of a thread that lets the EPP know that during the 5-year continuing approval review, evidence retained by the EPP will be reviewed to verify that the EPP processes are in alignment with TAC requirements. Let's take a closer look at some terms in these rules. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines evidence as a sign which shows that something exists or is true, and defines records as a collection of related items of information. Putting these terms together in the context of the TAC requirements that we just reviewed means that your EPP records will be a collection of different pieces of evidence that indicate processes and preparation occurred and requirements were met. Practically speaking, the evidence retained in EPP records is used in a variety of ways. Primarily, EPP staff refer to evidence in a candidate's record to verify that the candidate is meeting benchmark requirements, and ultimately to verify the candidate has met all requirements prior to recommending a certificate for the candidate. Additionally, candidates frequently leave an EPP and then return later to finish requirements. Evidence retained in records helps the EPP determine how to process the returning candidate. Candidates, school districts, and other EPPs often communicate with TEA via phone, email, and/or the help desk, asking various questions about a candidate's preparation or status with an EPP. While TEA can see some records in ECOS, we must often call upon the EPP to clarify or provide additional information so that we can assist the requester. The evidence that you retain in your records is also used during the 5-year continuing approval review to show that candidate preparation and EPP processes are aligned with TAC. It is important to note that a lack of appropriate evidence can have a negative impact on a candidate's ability to seek certification and on an EPP's continued approval. Okay, we have discussed that the EPP must retain evidence of a candidate's admission and completion of all requirements, and must retain evidence that EPP processes are aligned with TAC. So now let's look at some examples of evidence the EPP might retain. Keep in mind that evidence will reflect alignment with TAC. So when deciding what type of evidence to retain, use the wording in the related TAC requirement as your guide. There are other specific resources that you may want to use, as well as the requirement in TAC and the language in TAC, such as the figure in 19 TAC 228.10 that provides examples of evidence, or the continuing approval review rubric that is updated annually and posted on the program provider resources page on the TEA website. Before we dive into some examples of evidence for each component, please be advised that we will not have time to discuss every example of evidence that must be retained in your records. The resources mentioned here will provide support to you, as well as you may always reach out to your program specialist at TEA for guidance about other examples of evidence. Before we move forward and look at specific pieces of evidence, let's look at some general types of evidence that EPPs retain. If a TAC requirement identifies that a letter is required, or that the EPP must communicate with TEA or a candidate, then it is easy to determine that the evidence that needs to be retained is a copy of the letter or other communication. Letters signed and dated by the program legal authority or other authorized program staff, and emails that are time and date stamped may be retained as evidence of alignment with a variety of TAC requirements, such as formal offers of admission, official notifications to TEA, first contact between field supervisor and candidate, and ongoing coaching and support of candidates in clinical teaching, internship, or practicum. It is important to note here that there are other types of evidence that could be retained to support that first contact requirement and the ongoing coaching and support requirement have been met. In this case, the EPP would determine the best option for evidence to collect that works for the EPP. Some other types of documentation may naturally capture evidence of alignment with many different requirements. For example, official transcripts should be a piece of evidence found in every candidate record. For undergraduate and post-bac candidates, there should be 2 sets of official transcripts. Transcripts provide required admission data such as GPA, a conferred degree, the number of subject-specific content hours completed by the candidate prior to admission, and demonstrations of English language proficiency and basic skills that are all used to qualify applicants for admission. Transcripts may also provide the data needed to determine if candidates have met certification requirements, such as a conferred degree and English language proficiency demonstration. If the EPP is asked to provide or retain evidence the candidate met all admission requirements, then the transcript would support numerous of these requirements. Some common documents used by EPPs may capture evidence of alignment with a few requirements, or may be formatted to capture evidence of alignment with many different requirements. The observation instruments used by field supervisors to observe candidates during clinical teaching, internship, or practicum may be a powerhouse of evidence if they are formatted to collect certain kinds of information. For example, a simple document may capture a date, which is used to verify observation frequency, and may capture the time or duration of the observation, along with the educational practices observed and candidate demonstration of proficiency. Adding a few more elements to the document, the field supervisor may also capture placement information that would be evidence that the placement is appropriate for the certificate sought by the candidate, that the pre and post conferences were held with the candidate, and the observation outcome was communicated to the appropriate campus personnel. Signatures of candidate and field supervisor on the observation document reinforce the evidence captured on the document. Mentor, cooperating teacher, or site supervisor agreements are another type of document commonly used by EPPs. This document may simply capture evidence that a mentor was assigned to the candidate, or may be expanded to capture evidence that the placement is aligned with the certificate sought by the candidate, that the mentor meets the qualification requirements, and that the mentor has received training. Signatures on the agreement by the mentor and by someone who can verify the qualifications of the mentor reinforce the evidence captured on the document. Let's review now some examples of evidence by component. We'll start with component 1, which is the governance component. The governance component contains TAC requirements for your advisory committee activity. The evidence you collect will be pertinent to the various requirements for the advisory committee membership, training, and activity. For example, the advisory committee must meet at least one time per year to discuss the design, delivery, evaluation, and major policy decisions of the EPP. Meeting minutes reflecting dates and discussion items are perfect evidence to show the EPP has met this requirement. Sign-in sheets or certificates of participation are excellent evidence of an individual's attendance at meetings or trainings, and this includes attendance in advisory committee meetings. Additionally, evidence that the EPP has provided information to committee members about their roles and responsibilities on the committee may be captured in meeting minutes or via copies of bylaws or handbooks distributed to and acknowledged by the members. Often, EPPs will present an agenda as evidence of advisory committee activity. While it is acceptable to retain the agenda in records, the agenda is really not evidence of activity. The agenda represents what you intend to accomplish at the meeting, but does not reveal what was accomplished. The EPP is required to provide notices to TEA for a variety of reasons. Some of these reasons are included here, such as if the EPP wants to amend a program or open a new site. Evidence is, quite simply, the letter or notice on file at TEA. The records retention requirement identifies evidence must be retained of the candidate's eligibility for admission, which includes evidence that the candidate met a variety of admission requirements. Let's look at formal admission as our example. A candidate must be admitted before he or she may begin training or testing. The admission process requires the EPP to extend a written offer to the applicant that reflects the formal date of admission. The applicant must accept that in writing, and the EPP must notify TEA within 7 days of the admission. Evidence the candidate has been formally admitted is the letter with dates and signatures. The letter may be a paper copy or it may be an email. The letter is a piece of evidence that is expected to be retained in the candidate's record. To notify TEA of the new candidate's admission, the EPP must create an admission record in ECOS for the new candidate within 7 days of the admission date in the letter. Evidence that this has occurred is collected by TEA from the audit trail in the ECOS admin screen, which shows the date the record was created. Finally, no preparation or anything that leads to certification may begin until an applicant has been formally admitted. There are actually several pieces of evidence that would be considered together to support the EPP is aligned with this requirement. The admission date in the candidate admission letter should be before the dates that are reflected in other pieces of evidence for the candidate, including benchmark documents, degree plans, transcripts depicting semester coursework completed, FBE clinical teaching or practicum logs, and certificate issuance and effective dates. These are some examples of evidence you would collect regarding admission. For additional examples, refer to the Figure 19 TAC 228.10B1 for examples. Now let's look at some examples of evidence that would be retained to show the programs are aligned with curriculum requirements. For example, let's look at 2 of the curriculum requirements. 19 TAC 228.30A states that curriculum must be standards-based. Acceptable evidence that reflects the EP programs provide standards-based curriculum include course syllabi with relevant standards addressed within each syllabus, and curriculum alignment charts that show that all standards are taught across the courses in the program degree plan. In the second example, the evidence supports that the EPP programs use assessments to measure candidate progress. Acceptable evidence would be syllabi for courses in the candidate's degree plan that reflect assessments. Examples of performance-based assessments that are aligned to standards and the related rubrics are evidence that will be requested by TEA during a 5-year continuing approval review and when an EPP applies to add a new certificate category or class. These are just 2 examples of evidence you would collect regarding curriculum alignment with requirements in TAC. For additional examples for Component 3, see the Figure 19 TAC 228.10B1. There is quite a bit of evidence that an EPP must retain to support that a candidate completed all program requirements, and ultimately that the programs within the EPP are aligned with requirements in Component 4 related to coursework, training, program delivery, and ongoing support. The first example relates to documenting the completion of field-based experiences. A teacher candidate must complete a minimum of 30 hours of field-based experiences, or FBEs, that meet the requirements in 19 TAC 228.35E. The evidence that you would retain must reflect that the candidate completed experiences that met all of the requirements as identified in the applicable TAC. Some programs have one comprehensive powerhouse document completed by the candidate that contains a log capturing the date, duration, activity, subject area, grade level, and campus, and is verified by the teacher of record that hosted the candidate. Additionally, the one-pager has a place for the candidate to complete guided reflections of the experiences. Other programs have more than one document or process for collecting evidence that FBE hours are completed as required. One page may hold the log, while a separate page may be a typed reflection emailed by the candidate to the program or uploaded to the program through a candidate portal or app. Whatever works for the program is acceptable as long as the documents are collected and retained as evidence in the candidate's record. The second example shows evidence that would be retained to support that a candidate completed an internship as identified in 19 TAC 228.35E2B. The evidence you would retain that the internship actually occurred is the completed statement of eligibility signed by the EPP and campus or district staff, a candidate placement list reflecting the test passed, start and end dates of the internship year, placement information, and assigned campus and field supervision. Some of this evidence may also be captured within evidence of alignment with other requirements, such as the signed mentor agreements and observation documents that we highlighted earlier. These are just two examples of evidence you would collect regarding candidate completion of program requirements. Please see figure 19 TAC 228.10B1 for additional examples for component 4. Component 5 contains rules around assessment and evaluation of candidates and EPP programs. EPPs are required in 19 TAC 228.40A to have benchmarks reflecting candidate progress through completion of requirements. Each candidate record should contain evidence of those benchmarks. A benchmark is defined as a standard or point of reference against which things may be compared or assessed. As such, there are a variety of different types of benchmarks that EPPs have implemented. Teacher programs have the benchmark that candidates must demonstrate proficiency in the 150 hours of pre-service coursework before beginning clinical teaching or internship. Another benchmark may be completion of test readiness requirements prior to test approval. Whatever benchmarks your programs have in place to measure and ensure candidates are meeting requirements and progressing through your programs, you must retain the evidence. Many programs have checklist documents reflecting the date each benchmark requirement was met by the candidate. That is acceptable as evidence to retain in each candidate's record. Other programs retain the individual pieces of evidence that each benchmark was met, such as a certificate of completion of a course or test preparation module. The second example is for 19 TAC 228.40E that requires the EPP to continuously evaluate the design and delivery of the EPP components based on performance data, scientifically based research practices, and the results of internal and external feedback and assessments. Evidence of alignment with this requirement that should be retained in EPP records would be an individual plan detailing the activity, timeline, person responsible, and data results from your internal and external evaluations. You would also want to retain your dated advisory committee meeting minutes where results of your program evaluations were discussed. These are just two examples of evidence you could collect regarding requirements for program and candidate assessment and evaluation in component 5. For additional examples, see the figure in 19 TAC 228.10B1. It is worth mentioning here that this is the second time in this presentation that we have seen that advisory committee meeting minutes are evidence. As mentioned earlier, one piece of evidence may suffice to show alignment with more than one TAC requirement. That is perfectly acceptable. Component 6 is about professional conduct. We like to think that evidence of EPP staff and candidate adherence to the Educator's Code of Ethics found in 19 TAC 247.2 is one of the easier pieces of evidence to capture and retain in EPP and candidate records. It is also one of the more important records because professional conduct forms the foundation for educator preparation and for ongoing employment as an educator. The wording in the applicable rule says, during the period of preparation, the Educator Preparation Program shall ensure that the individuals preparing candidates and the candidates themselves understand and adhere to the Educator's Code of Ethics in 19 TAC Chapter 247. The best way to fulfill this requirement is to provide the relevant training and then have the individual sign a document of understanding and abiding. The signed document is your evidence. Of course, on the outside chance that an individual in your program does not adhere to the Code of Ethics as promised, then your EPP would also retain evidence of the action that was taken as a result. This could be a written warning, a letter of dismissal, or other. Programs often ask if ethics coursework or a syllabus for an ethics course would count for this requirement. While this is excellent evidence that you have met the training requirement for ethics, it is really a best practice to get a signed statement from each candidate early in the certification process where the candidate acknowledges understanding and adherence. We have worked with several EPPs who have had to use that signed ethics agreement to support the decision to release a candidate from a program due to an ethics violation. The rules around the required complaints process require several different types of evidence. Transparent and easy to locate complaints processes are important, and TEA often refers candidates to the EPP complaints process when they contact us with problems or concerns. Evidence of an accessible complaints process is easy to establish. Just post the process in all the places identified in TAC, including at TEA, on the EPP website, at the EPP physical site, and in some written form that could be handed to an individual that asks for it. On a side note, please remember to send TEA a new copy when you update your complaints process. We often refer to those when we are providing guidance to candidates who call in with concerns. Before recommending an intern, probationary, or standard certificate, EPP staff are responsible for ensuring the candidate has met all requirements for that certificate. There are multiple requirements that must be met for certification, and therefore, there are multiple types of related evidence that must be retained in records. The evidence that will be retained in records will be dependent on the certificate sought. Certification in some certificate areas may have unique requirements that other certificate areas do not have. The best evidence that a candidate holds the appropriate degree required for a specific certificate is an official transcript that reflects the degree and the date the degree was conferred. An official service record provides evidence of teaching experience for those certificates that require service, and a statement of qualifications, or SOQ document, provides evidence of work experience for those certificates that require licensure and work experience. To provide evidence that a candidate has completed the EPP as required in 19 TAC 230.13b3, you would provide the benchmark document that shows the date that each benchmark was completed. Note the completed benchmark document is used as evidence that the program has benchmarks, as was mentioned earlier, and is also evidence that the candidate completed requirements. Observation documents and transcripts are some types of evidence that reflect completed coursework and training also. Evidence that a candidate has met the testing requirement for a certificate may be collected from ECOS or from a score report. The information may be recorded on a benchmark document or a copy downloaded or scanned into the candidate's record, such as with a score report. These are just a few examples of evidence you would collect to support that a candidate met requirements for certification. For additional examples and guidance, see the figure that we've already mentioned in 19 TAC 228.10b1. Okay, we've reviewed some reasons why EPPs must retain evidence and some examples of types of evidence that should be retained in records. Now let's look at how records should be retained. The EPP is required to have procedures and practices in place to ensure all evidence retained in EPP records is secure. Specifically, that records are not used for unauthorized purposes, disclosed, modified, destroyed, or misused in any way prior to the expiration period of 5 years. EPPs frequently reach out to TEA with questions about the best way to retain records. These questions usually are about whether records must be in paper copy or electronic. There is no perfect answer to the question, which is better, paper records or electronic records, unless you're a tree. Some EPPs keep only paper records stored in file folders in secure file rooms. Other EPPs have only electronic records, and some have a combination of both paper and electronic records. Regardless of the type of records retention employed by the EPP, the expectation for evidence and retention is the same. In other words, if a document requires a signature, the EPP with electronic records may have to explore the best way to capture a signature. EPPs may scan and upload a signed document. Some use electronic signatures or e-sign, and some have portals that time and date stamp activity from approved users. Time and date stamped emails also suffice as electronic evidence. Additionally, records must be secure, whether in a locked file room or on a secure server. One thing to note here about electronic records is that during an on-site review of an EPP, the EPP staff must access electronic records for the TEA review team. TEA staff will not log into and access EPP records in EPP databases. We've circled back to the original requirement that we reviewed at the beginning of the presentation. 19 TAC 228.40F that requires the EPP to retain evidence of a candidate's admission to the EPP and completion of all requirements also requires that evidence to be retained in EPP records for a minimum of 5 years from the time the candidate leaves the EPP for any reason. The rules about continuing approval reviews of EPPs also require a records retention period of 5 years. I should note here that you may need to retain records longer, especially if your local records retention policy is longer than 5 years. As mentioned earlier, TEA often gets phone calls from candidates who completed a program but did not follow through with certification for a variety of reasons. They often want to know what they need to do to finish requirements, get test approval, get a certificate for a teaching job, or a variety of other questions about preparation. Your records provide the candidate the direction needed to move forward and become certified. In summary, EPPs are required to retain records. The records will contain pieces of evidence documenting a candidate's eligibility for admission and documenting the program requirements that were completed by the candidate. The records will also contain evidence that show the EPP is aligned with applicable TAC. The evidence that is collected is dependent upon the TAC requirement. All records must be retained for a minimum of 5 years, and for candidate records, the 5-year retention period starts when the candidate leaves the EPP. Beyond being required to retain records, there are practical reasons to do so, such as a candidate needing records to transfer to a new EPP, or TEA calling upon the EPP to produce records to provide guidance to candidates, or for the purpose of a continuing approval review of the EPP. While we were unable to present examples of all types of evidence and every record that the EPP must retain, you have several places to find the examples of evidence that you might retain. The graphic in 19 TAC 228.10b1, the continuing approval review rubric for 2021 that's posted on the Program Provider Resources page. This rubric has recently been updated for the EPP reviews and is updated annually. And you may always contact your assigned program specialist, who is happy to assist you and help you explore options for evidence and records retention. Give us a few days and a recording of this webinar and responses to your related questions will be posted on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. We thank you for your participation today. If you have a minute, please be sure to complete our short survey at the end of this webinar. This concludes the webinar for today.